I was frustrated after years of struggling with my mixes, not reaching the professional sounding results like the pro mixers I looked up to, even when I'd get my hands on professional sessions available online. It led me to a conclusion. Snares don't matter, guitar tones don't matter, world-class engineered tones don't matter if my lack of knowledge and experience were just going to ruin the tracks in front of me anyways. But what was it that I was missing? I mean, I studied anything and everything I can get my hands on, but none of it made sense. Until I realized some genius mix advice from professional mixing engineers that I wish I would have paid attention to earlier than obsessing over their studios, gear, and plugins. And in this video, I'm going to go over some incredible mixing advice that completely changed my life, including one that answered an age-old question that many mixing engineers find themselves stuck on. Starting with the piece of advice I got from my mentor, producer and mixer Beau Burchell. When I first started working with Beau, I was excited to see what secrets he had up his sleeve, but the biggest question I had was regarding a question I think a lot of mixers find themselves scratching their heads at. When do you know when to sample replace a drum and how to pick a drum sample? When I asked Beau this question, he gave me 2 great tips that forever changed my mindset when it came to both of these questions. Beau told me one of the first things he does after a mix session is prep is he boosts the top end of the toms and snares to about 10 to 15 dB to hear exactly how much cymbal bleed and hi-hat bleed is in the microphones. Yeah, that was my face too. Like having X-ray vision, Beau's tip allows him to see through the layers of the drum sounds, and by boosting the top end of the tom and snares, it reveals the severity of the bleed from the cymbal and hi-hats, providing valuable insight into the recorded drum shell's characteristics and informing further processing decisions. For example, this would let Beau know if gating too tightly to combat the increased bleed from the hi-hat would destroy the decay of the natural snare. So aside from his insanely awesome gating trick that I covered in my Sneaky Snare Tricks video, Beau used this as his first indicator that he would probably need to find samples to blend for more top end, mid-range, or body, depending on the amount of mic bleed from the cymbals. If the recorded drum shell at a balance level wasn't too bad, it would stick around to keep the natural feel of the drums, which would pair nicely with the samples. And the samples would be the ones that would get the loving boosts. But Beau's other piece of advice might be a little controversial to some mixing purists. But the truth is sometimes the tracks that get sent to us to mix could have 1 or 2 big issues. First issue is the amount of bleed, tuning, or performance issues, which are all engineering problems that do happen. Second, the toms or snares may not work within the context of the song that you're mixing anymore. And pitching the drum shells can alter the character too much. And often mixers end up with greatly convoluted looking signal chains like this one. Beau told me that one of the biggest epiphanies he had as a mixer wasn't being too precious about the provided drum shells is what can actually hold mixes back. Sometimes the best move to make is to just get rid of the problematic drum shells altogether. And with the track playing, find drum shell samples that fit within the song and get you 80% there without any processing. And then another thing that pros know to do that often gets overlooked by aspiring mixers is to find a room or overhead shell sample that marries with your overhead and room sounds from the recorded kit. Believe me, I know. Sometimes our egos as mixers want us to use what's given, but if it's not right for the track, that is ultimately what matters and should be the deciding factor on what is the right move for the artist's song. This next one is used by mixers like Eric Valentine and Jason Joshua, to name a few. It's an alternative way to boost the characteristic that you like in an instrument's frequency range that also helps create its own unique space that doesn't require EQ. I've actually talked about it a few different times on the channel because of its power. Multiband saturation is a secret weapon that when harnessed correctly can save you a trip to the Mix EQ emergency room.
Look, he's waking up!
Oh my god. Where am I?
Another multiband tool that I know I never gave any sort of attention to because its functionality made 0 sense to me and I would wonder why anyone would want to use it. It's an inverse or reverse compressor. Why would anyone want to use something like that? That was until I saw mixers like Kurt Ballou, Richard Checky, and Andrew Wade use this tool in mixes that immediately blew my mind away because of its power. And yes, I slapped myself for being arrogant and not trying to use it sooner. Expanders are like faucets. You get what you want from the source when it's time and then you close it. And the difference between an expander and a gate is a gate shuts off the source completely, whereas an expander still lets some of the source through at a lower amount. And using expanders in a multiband capacity changes everything. For example, you can use a plugin like ProMB or MH Multiband Dynamics and have the top end open up when a snare hits and then close once it's done. Or on a distorted guitar tone, control the crazy feedback in the high end. Both are just some examples where an expander can sound cleaner and more musical than using a traditional gate. But that isn't the only tool that gets overlooked. Yet again, another dynamic processor that I only saw as a one-trick pony, put on planet Earth to control sibilant frequencies. But it turns out, I wasn't using this tool to its full potential, and missing out on some amazing ways to utilize it to control rogue frequencies on an instrument. It wasn't until I saw a video featuring Kevin Churko, who was using a de-esser to control the growl in a distorted bass. That is when I started to question everything. Then TLA showcased at a trade show event that he minimizes the cymbal bleed on a snare mic by thinking of the hi-hat and cymbals as S's. And you guessed it, using the de-esser to just de-ess the cymbal bleed on the snare mic. And there are two other tricks with de-essers that I covered in both of these videos that I'll link down in the description of this video. And what would a video on Genius Mix Advice be if the Lord of the Mix himself, Chris Lord-Alge, didn't have a few tips? The next 3 pieces of advice are so ridiculously simple, but have had a huge impact in my mixing. For example, when dealing with bass, I would often reach for a high pass and low pass filter, and then start taking out the mids, and then boost low end and maybe some upper mids for crunch. But my bass was always overpowering, and I'd end up with the mess of a bass tone and a mix that sounded like it'd been thrown into a swamp. TLA's bass tip is simple. Listen to each note in the low end and filter out the note that is bigger in volume compared to the rest of the performance, or boost the note that is quiet in comparison to the rest of the performance first. By using the EQ to first balance the note definition of the entire performance is where the magic of getting the bass to lock in with the kick really happens. Or how about when a track isn't loud enough in your mix? I bet like me, you've done limiting, clipping, gain from a trim plugin, or fader automation, and it still doesn't sound right, or it's overpowering everything. Well, CLA loves to keep it simple. Surprise, surprise. And if a track isn't loud enough and getting lost in a mix, CLA will just duplicate the track in question. Now you have 2 times the volume and you can back off the duplicate and move on. I really shudder to think of all those times I kept hitting a limiter or clipper just to get something to be more heard in a mix. It's incredibly frustrating when sometimes the answer is so simple, but you just want to overcomplicate everything. Or maybe it's just me. Let's say it's just me. And something else that gives me the shivers is something I think many of us can relate to when mixing. You have a mix going and about 95% done, but a track or two aren't gelling just right. So you make adjustments to your signal chain, but because you have a million plugins, you have to adjust everything in the chain. But then you realize the settings you had works for another part of the song, so you have to go back, maybe make some automation to the levels on the plugin at that one spot. Then have the settings go back for the other spot. Before you know it, you've opened up the doorway to a mixed multiverse with infinite possibilities and outcomes, and some of which are the worst. Well, CLA's advice to avoid this is simple and irked me because of how embarrassingly obvious it was after he mentioned it in an interview. A practice CLA always employs when beginning a mix is leaving the first slot of his Pro Tools signal chain open, and recommends this to all mixers. Having the first insert open allows for the mixer to add a trim or gain plugin. With this in front of your chain, you can have better control of the signal feeding into your signal chain. And if needed, lets the mixer automate the gain levels within the trim or gain plugin. This next one from Hakir King really helped fix a problem I didn't realize I even had in my mixes. Maybe you've had this same strange phenomena happen. You send your track or tracks to a parallel bus of some kind, but notice that something's off. You can't quite pinpoint it, but you know it's odd sounding, and when you mute the parallel bus, the strange thing in your mix disappears. Hakir actually ran into this problem many times with outboard gear, and it's something that he pays close attention to because sometimes a piece of gear or plugin can introduce weird phase or polarity shifts. So Hakir always has a plugin with phase and polarity options as the first insert, just in case he starts to notice things get awry. Now this next piece of genius advice, I'm puzzled that it isn't taught first or talked about more when it comes to EQ when you first start out. I wonder if you can spot what I'm talking about. Here's example A and here's example B. Typically our first thoughts are to reach for muddy frequencies, harsh frequencies, and use filtering to clean up the sound and make room, which is what any textbook for beginner EQ would have us believe. And it's not 100% wrong, but technically it isn't the first place we should start. Because there are a set of frequencies every instrument has that should be addressed first, which is going to let the instrument fit better within a mix. In example A, there's actually one spot to address first. Example B, it should be here. These little bastards are the culprit behind why so many of us over EQ in our mixes. and ending up with instruments that just can't fit in a mix no matter what we do, and leave us feeling worse than the cast of Bridesmaid with food poisoning. These little no pun intended, are why plugins like Soothe 2, Equalizer, and Rezo are picking up steam by mixers. Their sole focus is to destroy any resonant frequencies that plague a mix or instrument. For example, with the drum shell, instead of filtering and cutting out the mids, first find the fundamental, and then find the first resonant overtone. And start with a small cut and watch how the body of the drum comes to life. With guitars, remove these frequencies in the top end and the mid-range will help get them fuller at the start. So there is an age-old question many engineers constantly ask themselves. You see it in forums, it gets asked in various interviews with pro mixers. It's probably one of the most asked questions for a lot of mixers. What comes first, the EQ or the compressor? It always seemed like some sort of secret only the pros were in on. And Jack Joseph Puig gives a pretty dorky explanation.
Because all these compressors, right, are frequency oriented. How they detect the audio and then tell the rest of the unit what to do has a lot to do with frequencies. If you have a lot of low frequencies, they move one way because again,
Hence how
because they
de-esser
perceive,
works.
because they perceive a long note as opposed to a short note. It has a brain too, right? The way the photocell works, the way it thinks. You change that for the feel, and then you could change on the other end less or more of what you did, so that what you end up in the end is something that's satisfactory from a frequency perspective, but you get the feel that you wanted.
When I took a step back to think about the question, should you EQ or compress first? I realized the reason it was such a difficult thing to figure out in a mix was because I was asking the wrong question. The answer is one many of us engineers hate hearing.
It depends.
But the right question is actually, how does the source sound and what do I need to do to get it what I need it to do in the context of the mix? Well, is the instrument dynamically all over the place? You might want a transparent compressor to rein in the dynamics of this instrument before you start sculpting with EQ. So compressor first. But what happens if the compressor is reacting a lot to certain frequency ranges and making the transparent compressor work overtime? Then throw an EQ in front to cut those frequencies conflicting with your compression. And this is the same if dynamically the instrument sounds great, but has some boxy frequencies. Then the EQ would take out those boxy frequencies. And if you're sitting there wondering, well, how do I know if I want to use a transparent or character compressor like an LA2A, Fairchild, or 1176? Same answer. It depends. What vibe and character are you going for? Is the source overly dynamic, but you want to correct it, but give it some mid-range umph? Then you might want to try a tube or Verimuse style compressor to rein it in instead of the transparent compressor and get that mid-range umph. It's all about understanding what the source needs to fit in the track, then what you want to add to it based on your own taste and what's right for the mix. When I finally discovered all this advice, I felt like Robbie Hart in The Wedding Singer.
Things that could have been brought to my attention yesterday!
But this isn't the only advice I wish I would have known earlier in my career that would have shortened the painful learning gap and sped up the process to getting the professional sounding results I wanted in my own work. Which is why you'll want to watch this video right here for some incredible advice pro mixers have to help you avoid painful mistakes that can stop you from getting the results you want out of your mixes.